I woke up, but something was wrong. My body felt stiff, my mind was foggy, and then I saw him, my nephew, standing way too close. His face, it didn't look right. It was a quiet night, the kind where the air feels heavier than usual, pressing down like an invisible weight. Outside, the rain tapped against the window in a steady rhythm, soothing and repetitive. The house was completely silent, wrapped in darkness with only the occasional creak of old wood settling under the weight of time. The warmth of the blankets made sleep come easily. There was nothing unusual about that night, at least not at first. But somewhere, in the middle of a dream, something shifted. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't even fully noticeable. It was a feeling, a slight disturbance in the air, like someone had exhaled too close to my face. I stirred slightly, adjusting my position, pulling the blanket up higher, but something felt off. It was a strange awareness, the kind that lingers at the edge of consciousness. My body remained heavy with sleep, but my mind, somewhere deep inside, whispered that something was wrong. The first thing that caught my attention, without me even realizing it, was the door. I always closed it before sleeping, a habit I never skipped, but now it was slightly open, just enough for a sliver of darkness to spill into the room. Maybe it had been like that before I slept, maybe I'd forgotten to shut it properly. My mind tried to reason, to make sense of the small detail, but there was something else. The blanket. I was certain I had been fully covered, yet now it had slipped just slightly down my chest, as if something or someone had tugged at it gently. Then I heard it, a noise so faint it barely reached my ears. A soft, almost non-existent sound, breathing, slow, steady, controlled breathing that did not belong to me. A chill ran down my spine as my heart started to beat a little faster. My body was still sluggish with sleep, my eyes still adjusting to the darkness. The room was dim, with only the faintest glow from the window, but as my vision sharpened, my gaze drifted upward, toward the foot of my bed. And that's when I saw him, my nephew, standing there, completely still. His posture was unnatural, stiff like a statue. His face was partially hidden in the shadows, but his eyes, those I could see, wide open, staring directly at me. He didn't move, didn't blink, just watched. A wave of confusion hit me first. Why was he here? It was the middle of the night. He was supposed to be in his room, asleep. Had he had a nightmare? Was he sleepwalking? I opened my mouth to speak, but for some reason the words felt thick in my throat. "Hey," I finally managed, my voice hoarse from sleep. He didn't respond. I blinked, trying to wake myself up fully, trying to push away the last traces of drowsiness, but the heaviness in my chest didn't go away. There was something about the way he was standing, about the way his head was tilted, just slightly to the side, like he was listening for something I couldn't hear. "Are you okay?" I tried again, my voice a little stronger this time. No reaction, no movement, not even the flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes. Something about the silence made my skin crawl. The way the shadows flickered slightly as the rain outside shifted. The way the air in the room felt colder than it had before. And then, before I could fully process what was happening, he took a step forward. A slow, deliberate step. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. There was something wrong. This wasn't normal. This wasn't how he usually was. Another step. My instincts screamed at me to move, to do something, but my body felt frozen in place. He was closer now, close enough that I could see his face more clearly. But something about it wasn't right. It looked like him, but at the same time, it didn't. There was a subtle, almost unnoticeable difference in his features. His eyes seemed darker, his skin paler, his lips pressed too tightly together as if he was holding something back. I forced myself to sit up, finally breaking out of my paralysis, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice laced with unease. That's when he moved, not in a normal way, not like a child shifting weight from one foot to another. It was quick, unnatural, his body leaning in too fast, too close, stopping just inches from my face. My breath hitched. His eyes were locked onto mine, his lips barely parted now, and then he spoke. But the words, if they even were words, made no sense. A low, murmuring sound, a whisper just under his breath. Not English, not any language I recognized. The tone was flat, emotionless, almost mechanical, like a recording played in reverse. I recoiled instinctively, my heart pounding against my ribs. "What?" He didn't answer, just kept whispering. The sound was wrong. The rhythm of it, the way his mouth barely moved, I could feel his breath against my skin, but it was cold. Too cold. It sent a shiver straight through my bones. Then, suddenly he stopped. His lips closed, his face relaxed. And slowly, ever so slowly, he smiled. Not a normal smile, not a child's smile, it was wide, too wide. The corners of his mouth stretched just slightly past where they should, his teeth just barely visible in the dim light. I scrambled backward, pressing myself against the headboard. My mind screamed at me to wake up, to move, to do anything. But before I could react, before I could even fully register what was happening, he turned. Just like that, the eerie, stretched grin disappeared. His body straightened, his posture normal again. He turned away from me, walking toward the door with slow, even steps. He didn't look back, didn't say another word, just walked out, disappearing into the darkness of the hallway. I sat there, frozen, my entire body trembling, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I listened, waiting for any sign of movement, any sound of footsteps down the hall. Nothing. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. My eyes darted to the clock on the nightstand. The glowing numbers burned into my vision. 3 a.m. A shudder ran through me. My throat was dry. My mind raced with questions, with fear, with something I couldn't quite put into words. I forced myself to move, to get out of bed, to follow him, to make sure he was really gone. But as I reached the doorway and peered down the hall, my blood turned to ice. His bedroom door was wide open, but his bed was untouched, the blankets still neatly in place, the pillow undisturbed, as if no one had been in it all night, as if he had never left, as if he had never been there at all. The air in the room felt different, heavy, unnaturally still, the kind of silence that wasn't just quiet, it was suffocating, the kind that presses against the skin, making every breath feel too loud. A faint chill crept through the space, raising goosebumps along my arms. The rain outside had softened to a whisper, almost as if the world itself was holding its breath. Yet the most unsettling part wasn't the silence, it was him. Standing there rigid as a statue, his small frame casting an unnatural shadow against the dim light, his eyes locked onto mine, wide, unblinking. And in that moment, something deep inside me, something primal, whispered, "This is not right." I tried to shake off the unease. Maybe he had a nightmare. Maybe he was sleepwalking, logical explanations, something normal, something that didn't send cold dread trickling down my spine. "Hey," I murmured, my voice hoarse, the weight of sleep still clinging to my throat. No reaction. His expression didn't change, not a flicker of recognition, just watching. I shifted slightly, my limbs feeling heavier than they should, like my body wasn't fully waking up, like something was pressing down on me, keeping me sluggish. The whisper came next. Software incoherent. The kind of sound that barely reached the ears, but the mind still registered it. But his lips weren't moving. The whisper, it wasn't coming from him. A sharp, icy wave of dread spread through my chest. My muscles tensed. My breathing grew shallow. I strained to listen, trying to convince myself it was the wind, the rain, the house settling, but it wasn't. It was something else, something closer. Still, I forced myself to speak again. "Are you okay?" "Nothing. Just that same eerie stillness." Then, just as I was about to move, he lunged, not like a child shifting their weight, not like someone stepping forward to be comforted. It was fast, too fast. A blur of movement, his face inches from mine in the blink of an eye. I flinched, instinctively pressing back into the bed, my heartbeat slamming against my ribs. But he didn't touch me. Instead, he leaned closer, so close I could feel his breath against my cheek. Cold. Colder than it should have been. "Then," he whispered. The sound, if it could even be called that, was wrong. It wasn't in English. It wasn't in any language I knew. The syllables twisted unnaturally, stretching and breaking in ways the human voice shouldn't be able to produce. A string of sounds, rhythmic but warped, like a recording played backward. A voice speaking in reverse, low, flat, emotionless. A shiver rippled down my spine. My hands clenched into the sheets, my entire body rigid. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the feeling. I wasn't supposed to be hearing this. A thick, suffocating sense of dread coiled around my chest, squeezing tighter with each second. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out the rain, the wind, the world outside. And then he stopped. The whispering ceased. The air grew heavier. His breath no longer ghosted against my skin. Slowly, stiffly, he pulled back, tilting his head to the side in a movement that was almost curious, studying me, gauging my reaction. Then he smiled. But it wasn't right. It wasn't a child's smile. It stretched too far, the corners of his lips pulling back just slightly beyond where they should. His teeth gleamed faintly in the dim light. Too white, too straight. It was the kind of smile that wasn't meant to be comforting, the kind that made something deep inside me scream run. I finally moved. My body broke free from the paralysis, my limbs jerking as I scrambled back, pressing myself against the headboard. My breath came in short, sharp gasps. But he didn't react. He just stood there, smiling, then, without warning, he turned. Not slowly, not hesitantly. Just a smooth, unnatural pivot, his arms hanging loosely at his sides, his movements eerily controlled. And then, without another word, without another glance, he walked out. The door didn't creak, the floor didn't groan under his weight. He simply disappeared into the darkness of the hallway. The silence that followed was unbearable. For several long moments I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Then reality slammed back in. I forced myself upright, my hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the blanket. My eyes flicked to the clock on the nightstand. The glowing red numbers burned into my vision. 3 a.m. My breath hitched, a sharp, instinctive reaction I couldn't explain. Why did that feel significant? The thought gnawed at me, deep and unsettling. With my pulse still hammering, I hesitated only a moment before forcing my legs over the edge of the bed. My feet touched the cold floor, the chill biting against my skin, but I ignored it. Every muscle in my body screamed to stay put, to lock the door, to wait for morning. But I had to check. I had to be sure. Moving cautiously, I stepped into the hallway. The darkness swallowed me, stretching endlessly in both directions. I listened, straining for any sound, any sign of movement. Nothing. I turned toward his room. The door stood wide open. The dim light from the street lamp outside barely reached inside, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. I swallowed hard, took a step forward, and then I saw his bed, untouched. The blankets still perfectly smooth, the pillow uncreased, not the slightest hint that anyone had been in it all night. A sharp chill ran through my veins. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the empty bed, my mind racing. He had been standing in my room. I had seen him, felt his breath, heard his whisper. So why? Why did it look like he had never been here at all? A deep, bone-deep dread settled in my chest. Something was wrong, something I didn't understand, and worst of all, I had the sickening, unshakable feeling that whatever had stood in my room tonight, it wasn't my nephew. Morning light filtered through the curtains, but it did nothing to erase the lingering unease from the night before. Every logical part of the mind tried to rationalize what had happened. A nightmare, sleep paralysis, maybe exhaustion playing tricks. But deep inside, something refused to accept those explanations. The feeling was too real. The fear was too raw. The house was different in the daylight. Less eerie, more familiar. The walls didn't feel like they were pressing in, and the air no longer carried that suffocating weight. The hallway stretched ahead, normal and quiet. Yet the memory of last night still clung to every inch of the house, making each step feel heavier than it should have. But then something caught the eye. A piece of paper. It sat on the nightstand, crumpled at the edges, as if someone had left it there in a hurry. The sight of it made the breath hitch. That wasn't there before. Not last night. Not ever. Fingers hesitated before reaching for it. The texture was rough, old, as if the paper had been handled too many times, worn down by time itself. The handwriting was messy, almost frantic, written in a rush. But the words were clear. Don't wake up. A chill ran down the spine. The grip on the paper tightened as the mind raced. Who wrote this? Why? What did it mean? Each second that passed made the room feel smaller, the air thicker. The logical explanations fell apart one by one. There was no way this note had been there before. It was placed here, deliberately, and that meant someone had been here. The thought sent another shiver down the spine. Eyes darted around the room, scanning every corner, every shadow. Everything looked the same, but it wasn't. The feeling, the presence, it lingered. The house wasn't empty, not really. The door creaked slightly as it was pushed open, leading back into the hallway. Every sound felt amplified. The hum of the fridge, the faint rustling of leaves outside, the distant laughter of a child. Laughter. Heart-pounding steps quickened toward the sound. The living room. And there he was. The same child who had stood in the room last night. The same one who had whispered in that unnatural voice. The same one who had moved too fast, smiled too wide. But now, he was playing, laughing, acting as if nothing had happened. Watching him, unease twisted in the stomach. It didn't make sense. Hey, the voice came out too soft, almost hesitant. He turned, eyes bright, innocent. Good morning. The words were too normal, too casual. How did you sleep? The question made him pause. Just for a second, a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face, but then, good, he grinned. I had a dream about flying. No mention of last night, no hint of anything unusual, but that pause, that tiny, almost imperceptible pause, it meant something. The paper felt heavy in the pocket. The words burned in the mind. Don't wake up. The question came before there was time to reconsider. Were you in my room last night? A simple question, but the weight behind it was anything but simple. Another pause, longer this time. Something flickered across his face. too quick to catch. His lips parted slightly as if about to speak, but then he stopped. Finally, he shook his head. No. The breath hitched. You didn't come in at all? Another shake of the head. No. Lips felt dry. Are you sure? His expression didn't change, still smiling. But the pause was back. Then, finally, he spoke again. I wasn't in your room. The words were too precise, too careful, like they were chosen, like they were memorized. The room felt colder. The mind screamed for something logical, sleepwalking, a trick of the mind, anything that made sense, but then, why? His voice was light, curious. Did you see something? The grip on the paper tightened. 100 responses raced through the mind, but none made it out. The child was still watching, head slightly tilted, waiting. The paper burned against the skin. The words echoed, "Don't wake up." And for the first time, something terrifying became clear. It wasn't just a warning, it was a command. The feeling of unease refused to fade, lingering like a shadow even in broad daylight. Every logical explanation collapsed under the weight of what had happened. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. And if there was even the slightest chance that the mind wasn't playing tricks, there had to be proof. The first place to check was the security cameras. Every corner of the house had been recorded, every hallway, every doorway. If anything had happened last night, it would be there. The footage would either confirm the worst fears or put them to rest. Sitting in front of the screen, fast-forwarding through the earlier hours, everything looked normal. The kitchen lights turning off, the hallway empty, doors closed. Normal, safe. But then, the timeline reached 3 a.m. The screen froze. No movement, no static, no error message. Just nothing. The footage simply wasn't there. Heart pounding, fingers clicked back and forth, trying to recover the missing time. Nothing, a gap, as if those moments had never existed. A deep, slow breath. Cameras don't just stop recording. There was no power outage, no technical issue. Someone, or something, had erased it. The weight in the chest grew heavier. Maybe someone else in the house had seen or heard something. Maybe they could confirm that everything was normal, that the night had been uneventful. One by one, each family member was asked. A casual approach at first, nothing to raise suspicion. Did you hear anything last night? Did you wake up at any point? Did you notice anything strange? Every answer was the same. No. A simple, effortless no. No disturbances, no sounds, no movement. As if nothing had ever happened. The sense of isolation crept in, wrapping tighter like a rope pulling at the chest. There was only one place left to look, one last desperate attempt to make sense of it all. The old family photo albums. Flipping through the pages felt strange, almost surreal. Faded memories, frozen in time. Familiar faces, familiar moments. Smiles, laughter, snapshots of a life that now felt distant. And then, the page turned and the breath caught. A photo of the nephew, standing in the backyard, grinning at the camera, eyes bright with childhood mischief. A memory that should have been comforting, but instead, a jolt of pure dread. The nephew in the photo looked different, not in a way that most wouldn't notice, not in a way that would raise suspicion at first glance, but the longer the eyes stayed on the image, the more impossible it became to ignore. The chin, a scar, small, faint, but unmistakable, a mark from a childhood accident, something permanent, something that couldn't just disappear. Fingers trembled as the page was turned again. Another picture, another moment in time, the same scar, a permanent reminder of the past, but the nephew from last night had no scar. Everything inside went cold. That wasn't him. The realization hit like a crashing wave, drowning out every rational thought. If it wasn't him, then what was it? Something had been in the house, pretending, watching, mimicking, a presence that had known exactly how to look like him. But it wasn't him, it was never him. And the most terrifying part? It was still here. Sleep no longer felt like an escape. It had become a risk, a dangerous descent into the unknown, where something could reach out from the darkness and take control. Every night was a battle against exhaustion, but no amount of effort could stop the body from giving in eventually. The moment the eyes closed, the feeling returned, that suffocating, paralyzing presence. The house no longer felt the same. It looked normal, smelled normal, but something in the air had changed, a constant pressure, like unseen eyes following every step. The mind could lie, could convince itself that it was just paranoia. But the body knew. Instinct whispered warnings that couldn't be ignored. The feeling of being watched never faded. No one else noticed, no one else felt it. They laughed, talked, moved through their days as if nothing had ever happened. Maybe that was the worst part, being completely alone in the experience. Because if no one else saw it, if no one else believed it, how could it be real? But it was real. The nights proved it. The first few times it was subtle. Small shifts in the room, a drawer slightly open when it had been closed, a chair facing the wrong way. Little things. Things that could be brushed off, explained away. Then came the shadows. Not the normal kind, the ones cast by furniture or flickering lights. These moved. Shapes that lingered in the corners, just outside of clear sight. The moment attention shifted toward them, they would disappear. But they were there, always there. And then the whispers. It started with a single breath, so close it felt like someone was standing right behind. The kind of breath that tickled the skin, that made the hair at the back of the neck rise. Turning around revealed nothing, just empty air, silent and still. Then, a voice, faint, too soft to understand but undeniably real. A murmur drifting through the air like a secret meant to stay hidden. The sound didn't belong in this world. It didn't belong in this house. The lights stayed on after that. Sleep became a war, a desperate attempt to stay awake for as long as possible. Every night the fear grew stronger. The body would fight exhaustion, but it always lost in the end. And in those vulnerable moments, when consciousness slipped away, the presence returned, looming, waiting. One night, as sleep finally took over, the air turned thick, heavy, like something unseen had stepped into the room, standing too close. The whisper came again, this time clear as day. "Don't wake up." A breath against the skin, a voice that wasn't human, and then silence.